Hello everyone, welcome to Passive Wrappings, where we profile local visual artists and designers in the greater Boston area. My name is Steven Sarajian, and today we have a developing young graphic designer here, Miss Shannon Reed.
Hey everybody, I'm Shannon. I'm a graphic designer here in Boston, Mass, and I'm originally from Wisconsin, so in the Midwest, and I was fortunate enough to come out here for college, a four-year program in Lesley University over in Cambridge. And I got my BFA in design there, and I also had a photo minor. So now I actually am here full-time back in Boston after graduation and being able to work full-time for a company called ThinkArgus. So we're a creative agency. We do a lot of branding, marketing, advertising, social strategy, content planning, everything like that. So I personally do a lot of print-based stuff. That's one of the things that I love. We also do online assets, social assets, and copywriting. So we do a lot of different things, which is really cool.
All right, Shannon. Well, first thing I'm sort of wondering, you came here all the way from Wisconsin.
Yes.
What made you want to leave the land of the cows and come here to Boston?
Yes, I'm a true cheesehead, and I miss the cheese always. But as far as the arts, the coasts are really kind of the places to go. So especially for education, Massachusetts is really well known. It's on the coast. It's very close to a lot of communities in the arts. You can go to New York. You have Boston itself is like a creative hub for a lot of innovation. So really it kind of made sense for me to kind of come from there because we don't really have a lot of art schools or arts-focused programs in the Midwest. So being able to kind of come to the city and have those opportunities where the arts are like a little more incorporated into the communities and into the curriculum was something that I was looking for. And so I definitely found kind of my place in Boston because I didn't want to go to New York. It's a little too hectic for me, but Boston was kind of the right fit. Especially with all the history and, the arts community here is super involved and they're very welcoming where sometimes, if you go to a new place, sometimes it's hard to kind of meet people and network with people within those communities. So that's something that I love about Boston is that you really kind of get to meet people and network with people and everyone's so welcoming and supportive. And that kind of carries through even like when you're a student and into your professional career also.
So, when you came here to do your Bachelors of Fine Arts, what years were you involved with that program?
Yeah, so I came in for the fall of 2012, and then I graduated in the spring of 2016. So a little more recently, and then I was able to be hired full-time actually the following September after graduation, so the fall of 2016, which was really exciting. So being able to find something so soon after graduation was really encouraging, and I felt prepared, and being able to kind of jump into the industry right away is super helpful, especially being able to kind of use the skills, especially from senior year and graduating, kind of building those professional networks, being able to kind of jump into that right away was really exciting.
So what do you think of, because you mentioned the vibrancy of the community here versus back home.
Yes.
So what made you want to go with your current position? What made you gravitate towards the kind of work that we're going to be looking at in a moment, which is more print-based, as opposed to, there's a lot of areas right now, as you know, in design.
Right. Yeah, there's so many different facets, and I think the nice thing about design is that you can kind of choose what interests you the most, and you can also kind of cross those things over as well. So like my personal interest is print design, but I also enjoy doing online and different things like that. So I was excited about this position because I was able to really kind of do those print-based projects, but also I can kind of dabble in copywriting. I can work on social media platforms and content management. I'm able to kind of contribute conceptually. It's not just kind of creating design work to create design work. It's kind of being able to have those conceptual ideas and that strategizing as well. So it's not just production. So I feel like that itself really kind of helps me kind of round out as a professional. So having that as kind of my first position has been really rewarding because I'm not just executing someone else's ideas. I, can have my own input and kind of be a part of the larger team, and work with my superiors, the creative director, the principal, and really kind of have more hands-on experience. So I think that kind of was a great jump from college, and those experiences to the professional life.
Well, let's give people some idea of the kind of work that you do. Now,
Sure.
we're going to start with some of the stuff that I believe you did when you were actually at Lesley.
Yes, yeah. So some of the work I actually did while I was in school. So I had part of the time, so I do like a lot of print, but I also really enjoy packaging. So that was kind of one of the newfound things that I really enjoyed. So being able to not only create something that was visually like a 2D space, but kind of being able to wrap things around in more of a 3D kind of aspect. So how can I make something visual that is, more than just slapping a logo on something, or, how can I create a visual dialogue with something that's not just flat or online or something like that. So packaging was really an interesting time for me because it was kind of like out of the box, if you would like to go with that metaphor.
Interesting wording. So tell us about this initial project that you did.
So Taryn Chisholm basically was a brand that I created. So Taryn Chisholm is the uncontrollable urge to dance. So as someone who has a dance background, I was really kind of looking for something that kind of tied in to kind of my passions and being able to represent that visually. So basically the story of this brand was basically the funds from this, or some funds from this, would go to benefit dance education within schools and kind of help the youth kind of grow through those different programs. So that was kind of the idea behind this project, and kind of the dance theme kind of carries throughout visually also. So basically some of the, we'll look at the packages later, but some of the kind of graphic line work is actually Baroque period dance steps. So they're actually
can you explain what Baroque period dance steps are?
Yeah, so basically, there's different dance patterns. So throughout history, there's different choreography and different historical dance movements. So the way that those are annotated kind of vary, but basically you usually have circles with arrows to donate to note like basically what direction you should be going and kind of where to follow. Also, if you're doing a group dance, you have the two intersecting and kind of intertwining. So being able to find these and then be able to incorporate them as like a graphic element, but also kind of as a subtle nod to the dance theme of the work was a really exciting find for me, because I was like, oh, this is, not only like a graphic design element, but really it ties into kind of the overall conceptual idea. So being able to separate the packages and the types of content that was in them. So for instance, we did food packaging. So how can I tie this in basically to the food? So how do you tie dance and food together? So is it organic, or is it health-based foods, or is it food that is healthy, or snacks, things like that. So being able to kind of try to mesh all of those ideas and connect them together was something I was really striving for, and being able to show the product also. So having some photography in there, as well as the wood dance floor is kind of the nod to that also. It's kind of like also a kind of like clean surface, a bright surface. I wanted these to kind of really be vibrant. Mm-hmm. So basically kind of also following that expressive, very kind of lofty dance kind of aspect.
So as people are looking at these, mm-hmm. I think for people who aren't that familiar with the kind of work that you do, it's a lot of compiling of sort of different elements into a final product.
Yes. So a lot of times, I think that you can agree with this, is that, for a project to really kind of have legs, mm-hmm. It's more than just designing something visual. It's more about how can I communicate something to somebody? How can I do that in a way that is organized and makes sense and is able to have a large audience or even a small audience? How do I create a message that is positive or negative? How can I reinforce that? So being able to kind of start from the strategic aspect of that and the conceptual aspect kind of closes the loop for the visuals, because then you have these subtleties of things. And, even though, most people probably don't know what tarantism means, they probably have to look it up and things like that. But, being able to kind of discover those things and kind of those subtle things that kind of tie in, I think is kind of the more fun part of the visual language, just because you really get to kind of explore and discover new things and for yourself, instead of someone always having to tell you about it. You kind of get to live with the work, and you kind of get to see it, and you're like, oh, this is kind of cool. I wonder why I like this. And you kind of find new things that are intriguing about it. If that makes sense.
Right. I think this is really kind of separates design work from fine art work, mm-hmm. is that the focus is so much on that communication. And it can't be, well, it depends on the audience sometimes how abstract you can be with that.
Right.
And how direct you have to be.
Right. Exactly. And, especially with design, a lot of the times, it's usually in a marketing or advertising context. So, you're always trying to convey a message or convey an emotion or kind of an action or encouraging an action in some way. Whereas, some of the other kinds of art forms like fine art, you're more communicating a more personal or expression of yourself or something that you're trying to represent. So it's always a different kind of choice of voice and things like that I think can kind of range across the mediums. But I think design is like very much focused on the audience and how to communicate with them the best and like what exactly you're trying to communicate.
Right. So we saw in that work, and we're going to see in more of them going forward, that a lot of the graphic design work, you have to combine these different elements of illustration, of photography, of the text itself.
Yep.
So the next project, which you actually have here for us to look at, you did at the end of your BFA, correct?
Yes. So this technically, I guess, was a senior project, but really it ended up being more of like a thesis. So this was more of like a personal project that I kind of turned into more of like that thesis, kind of end of year, kind of capstone for myself. And so the project is the Starving Artist Project, and the title kind of plays on that whole trope of the starving artist, but actually it is a research project basically, and like I said, a thesis, so it includes academic research, it includes collected data, so I actually surveyed 116 students based on the content that I was trying to understand. So being able to interview students and faculty, basically the Starving Artist Project is focusing on art students specifically, but the college population in general, and how students, specifically art students, also have the tendency to put their basic needs like eating, sleeping, general health, kind of to the wayside, especially in college. So, if you're an artist and you have a bunch of studio classes, that's going to eat up a lot of your time, and you're expected to have this amount of credits, and you have this amount of outside studio time. A lot of students work, a lot of students do internships, and a lot of students also commute. So it's like, how do students kind of fit all of these facets of their lives into the kind of time frame that you have in college, and how does basically the things that kind of fall to the wayside, how does that affect your creativity as an artist, your productivity, and your overall health? Because, the habits you make as a young adult, from high school and college, and, after that also and kind of into your 20s, and, those habits tend to stay with you. So if you kind of create these habits of, not getting enough sleep, or, missing meals because you have too much work to do, or you running from one class to the other and you don't have time, how do those things kind of impact you long term? And specifically, college students are very much at risk for poor eating habits, disordered eating habits, a lot of eating disorders. What I found in some of the research was that, especially in college atmospheres, because they're so competitive, the competitive process of applying, staying in, you want to be top of your class, all of those kind of facets, as well as, the financial burden of higher education, as well as trying to, make friends, the social aspect, how do all of those things kind of reflect on the student, and how do they kind of cope with that kind of stress?
And all of this feeds into what in design is called your design brief for the project.
Basically, yeah. So it just
really, and I feel like that helps to really build the kind of visual system of these layouts, which give people an opportunity to look through. This is the first chapter.
Yes. And so what I really wanted to accomplish with this project, and it's still being designed, I'm still trying to make it approachable, because this subject, a lot of students don't realize that their habits are really detrimental to them, and that they can be long-term issues later down the line. And being able to make something that's approachable, something that people can kind of relate to and understand. It's not going to be like a super heavy textbook. There's a lot of, academic research that brings up a lot of points. There's also personal reflection, student reflection. And really the data that I found was really remarkable. Students were really open and forthcoming. It could be an anonymous survey if they wanted, or they could put their name with it also. And being able to have students kind of trust me and be so open was something that was really eye-opening for me and something that I really appreciated because, it's very hard to open up about things like, if you suffer from an eating disorder or if you, have depression and that affects your eating habits. If you, have financial problems and you feel like you don't have enough money to eat. People are very open with kind of their struggles with those things. And, as someone who, had also struggled with that in college, and that really is partially why this started.
These are some of the elements that you use in the design to actually show that.
Yeah, so the data I collected, I am showing visually, so through digital illustration. So basically the entire book is illustrated throughout digitally. And what I did for the senior show was I created basically an installation where
Now, when you say senior show.
Yes.
What is a senior show?
A senior show. So basically I've been working on this project for the entire senior year, if not a little before graduation. And so every senior, at least for us at Leslie, would have to have a senior show. So you would pick one project or a multitude of projects, and you would basically build out a showpiece that people would come and see at an opening, and you can, have takeaways and things like that. So what I did for my show is I wanted to really show some key data points, and I did that visually through, I actually had plates, like charger plates that I hung up on the wall, and I actually put real food like peppers and vegetables, and I created the stats out of that. And they actually ended up wilting over the course of the show, which was really interesting. So it kind
was
of
that planned as part of the overall design of the
kind of, yeah, because
show?
It's one of those things where it's like I wanted to use real kind of food because really that's what it's about, and kind of seeing how it decayed and kind of how it when it's not taken care of kind of falls apart. That was kind of the underlying factor of that too, where it's like, if you don't eat these things or if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to end up being healthy or having the kind of energy that you would need. So it's kind of the more subtle aspect of it. And then having the other kind of data points. I also had what I called takeaway cards, and I also had paper bags, so kind of like a paper bag lunch kind of thing. And so you kind of take all of these different cards that had different quotes or sayings that relate to a word. So there was one for innovation and one for, like self-care. So it was like different things that people could grab that they could take away with them. And so basically I phrased it as, please take what you need at this point. So being able to have something to take away with you, you can throw it in your wallet, and then one day maybe you're having a hard time and you just need to get a little pick-me-up, and one day you're looking through your wallet and you just pick it up and you're like, wow, this is kind of what I needed today. So that was kind of the aspect where it's sometimes we just need to be reminded hey, self-care or taking care of yourself is really important. Sometimes you just need to stop and breathe. So that was kind of the takeaway that I wanted people to have from the senior show at least, and then kind of relate to the content also.
Okay. After seeing the documentation of this, I regret not going to your show and being able to see it because I think that this gives people an idea of the sort of systems that you were building with this and sort of designing with space to fit the overall concept. And the way that you explain it, it actually sort of highlights a lot of that.
Thanks.
But you also minored in photography.
Yes.
Now, why did you do that?
So I also have, everyone always makes fun of me, but I have a tattoo on my wrist of a camera. And that was my first tattoo because I was in high school very much a photo kid. I started in fine arts, and then I kind of switched over to photo, and then I was like, I'm going to be a designer when I go to college. So I decided to...
So let's backtrack. Let's go back to high school.
Okay. So in high school, a lot of different programs at high schools, they are sometimes a little more built out than others. Sometimes, they aren't
I don't know,
much.
but go ahead.
But basically, I was fortunate enough at my high school that we had a pretty well-rounded arts program. So you could pick from the fine arts kind of aspect, so drawing and painting basically, or you had a photo class. They also had kind of a digital illustration class, so I took a lot of different courses in that, so kind of getting familiar with the Adobe programs as a head start was really helpful, I found. But I started in drawing and painting because that's just kind of what I had always done. I always knew I wanted to do art. So I was like, I'm going to take all the art classes I can.
So this goes back to childhood for you, that you were thinking about actually going into the visual arts.
Yes, that was like the one thing that I felt I was always passionate about and something that I always kind of really wanted to do in some way. There are times too that I really kind of wanted to do maybe like psychology or even social work, but I think that art kind of always kept calling back to me.
It's interesting that you say social work, because I immediately have to think about the last project that we were actually looking at.
Yeah, so the human experience, I think, and being able to relate to people, I think, has kind of also carried through my work, and I think that that hasn't been lost, you know, from focusing on the art specifically as a career. And the nice thing is that, you know, things that you're passionate about always kind of permeate their way into kind of what you look to do. So whether that be, you know, design, like I can still include my photography work, I can still include my research, you know, I can still include things I'm passionate about in the work that I do every day. And the arts specifically lend themselves really well to that crossover. But yeah, being able to kind of use all those skills that I've built up, you know, from years of trying new things and new mediums and, you know, different things, it's been exciting to kind of draw on those for different projects that I've been doing.
All right, we actually have on screen right now some of your photo work.
Yes.
And I think this is going to need some explanation for the people at home.
Yes.
So this is what's a technique known as a double exposure, if I understand correctly. So how does a double exposure work?
Yes, so basically these were created through analog photography. So for those of people who don't know or who, you know, are younger, who only know like digital cameras and things like that. So film photography goes
Because a lot of people might assume looking at this that this is digital work.
Right, no, this is all analog, so this is all film-based. So I actually had a film camera, still have it, and basically the way that you do in-camera double exposures is that you basically shoot a roll of film, and then you wind it up just enough that you still have the tab outside, and then you actually re-hook it to the camera. So basically you shoot a roll once, and then you actually reattach, and then you shoot over the roll that you just shot. So you expose it twice. So basically what I loved about this process, because my design brain kind of looks at things a little more formally versus more kind of loose and kind of gritty things. So I like very graphic, kind of abstract photos. So being able to do this project and really not have control over what the outcome was really kind of liberating for me. So being able to kind of have these happy accidents really kind of was high for me, because I was able to kind of shoot things that I thought would maybe be interesting. So for this series, basically, I shot a bunch of different kinds of skeletons that were in the library at Leslie, and you know, for anatomical and biology and things like that. So being able to kind of shoot different aspects of that, but then also going to like the MFA and being able to kind of take photos of different artworks that relate to the human experience, you know, life and death, the human body, and just kind of seeing how those were kind of transposed over each other and kind of seeing what came out of that. And like I said, like you really don't know what you're going to get out of it, because, you know, you can't see anything if you expose the film, you know, it's gone. So being able to get these gems out of that was really happenstance, which is kind of the most exhilarating part. And especially, this one is my favorite, being able to capture something like that so perfectly by accident. And being able to really be hands-on with this. So the nice thing about film is that, you know, it's very tactile. So being able to, you know, not only like shoot the roll and shoot the roll twice, but I, you know, develop the film, and then I am able to kind of explore what actually came out of it. You know, it's kind of, you're like, oh, how's this gonna go? Like, it could be a total wash. You know, you might not have any images that make sense, or, you know, they weren't exposed correctly on top of each other, so nothing really shows up. So being able to kind of explore that and also kind of be willing to kind of see what happens was like a really kind of drawing point for these photographs for me.
Yeah, this was different from probably a lot of the design work, because in design, generally speaking, you don't want to relinquish that much control.
Right.
There are examples I can think of where that's not the case,
right.
But generally speaking, you don't want to just send things to the printer and see what happens.
Right.
But with these, you really didn't know. It was kind of the luck of the drawer in many ways.
Yes. Yeah, and that's kind of the most fun part because, people always think that these are digital, and I always love being like, no, these happened by complete happenstance. This was completely kind of out in the universe because really, there's really no control that you have over it. And, being able to pull images that, are rewarding and visually interesting and kind of create almost surreal, abstract versions of, things that we are familiar with. That's also kind of one of the things that I like about these is that, the shapes and the content are familiar, but they're different. They're not what you would typically see, or it's a different perspective. So I think these kind of are a nice way to kind of challenge kind of the digital aspect because, you kind of get this layering effect without having to go to the computer. This is truly like hands-on kind of stuff, but, you also still get to be able to kind of, I don't know, just being able to really just kind of play with the content it's in, because you can use this technique really with anything, you can use it, I specifically chose that medium because I thought it was interesting to go together, but, you can do that with anything. If you have a film camera at home, definitely would recommend, taking the time just to see kind of what happens, especially for those who do it as a hobby. Film is not that expensive, 35 millimeter. Film is what I shot with this with, and yeah, you can still buy it places. You can still get it, developed, even if you don't have a darkroom around.
So these techniques are not that challenging that people at home could not try this themselves.
Right. So that's the best part is that, film, film is kind of coming back. It's still kind of its own kind of sector still, but, being able to, you can still get black and white film. You can get color. Color you actually can't develop yourself. It has to be sent out just because of the chemicals in it. But for those of you who have access to a darkroom, black and white film, you can develop yourself. Otherwise, CVS still does developing too. And if you have a film camera, even at antique shops now, you can really go and find great film cameras that are still working fantastically for great prices. And so if you want to do something kind of different, or as a hobby, definitely there are options for people at home. This isn't just like a fine art photography thing, which is nice. It's very accessible.
Yeah, I think that'd be interesting for a lot of people out there who are new to photography, that this is something that they can experiment with, and it doesn't take a lot of equipment to do it.
Right, and and it's basically, you either invest digitally or you can invest in more analog-based things. And like I said, film these days isn't terribly expensive, and like I said, the cameras you can find at antique stores, and even some companies are still carrying film cameras too, because they're kind of getting a resurgence. So yeah, definitely I would recommend if people are kind of interested in trying out new things, it's an easy enough process to do.
So, when you were at high school, and what was the thing that made you finally switch conceptually from more fine arts-based stuff to the more commercial kind of work that you're doing now?
Yeah, so I think that it was kind of like fine art was just kind of what I had always done because it was always offered, and I was always drawing things anyways, and I think it was kind of the natural progression, at least for me, for my interest, and I still love, drawing. I don't get to do as often as I'd like, but, being able to do that, and then I found photo, high school, I was really able to kind of delve into that. I actually learned how to shoot film in high school. We actually had a darkroom, so that was a really exciting thing because I was able to bring those skills into college. But, being able to try out film photography and then also digital photography and being able to do the digital kind of jumped me into like, what is design? Design's pretty cool, and, the way that I see things visually or my perspective as an artist tended to kind of lean toward the more graphic kind of elements, more organized things, and also just like tactile, like print-based things, just feeling something like a book or something like that. But every like kid thinks that you're like, oh, I'm gonna like make posters and like band logos and CDs, and covers and stuff. And like as I grew up and like obviously went to college and realized that there's a lot of different places and options that you can do within the field. You can go the music route. You can do CDs, bands, and things like that. But you also can do logos and branding. You can do a bunch of other things too.
There's something you mentioned which has come up before on the show. Do you think that most people who go into these fields usually had some tendency when they were very young that led them there? Because it seems like you, at a fairly early age, were going in that direction. Do you think that just generally tends to be true with people that you've met?
Like in the arts?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, especially from a young age, I think there are people who just know. I think that's why a lot of students, very much seek out arts schools, basically, once they are able to, because they're like, this is what I love to do. I want to do this for work. Like, I want to get paid for the things that I love to do.
Here's the thing. I agree with you. This seems to be the truth. This was not the truth for me. Like, for me, this actually was not the case.
Wow.
I actually decided to do this fairly late. I was already in my 20s when I really decided to commit to it. But I found that is generally true. I'm sort of an outlier in that respect. One of the things that we have here is actually an integration of your photography and your use of typography here.
Yes.
And sometimes we're throwing these terms around. So maybe you'd like to explain what typography is and what I mean when I say that?
Yeah, so I'll try to kind of put it out there. So typography basically is the way that you treat type. So, whether that be something like this, where it's like a magazine spread, or, whether you're writing a letter. So it's basically how you create a hierarchy within the content that you have. So like here, this typography is very flowing. This is a headline. But there's also kind of a tagline or a subheadline at the top. So especially in like editorial spreads, which is what these are basically moving towards, you do a lot of larger type. You do more kind of graphic elements, larger, big kind of type. But then there's also projects where, the type should be really refined or small. And we always, especially in design, type has a voice. So, you may think that, they just chose this random font and that's just, they just like it. So there's a lot more that kind of goes into typography. Basically, we go through a bunch of different fonts and we try different things because each font might have, or typeface, has a voice to it. So what does this typeface communicate? Is it refined and very classical, or is it very bold and strong and kind of bright and in your face? Is this communicating something that's kind of small and fragile and dainty?
When you were going into this project, what were the things you were trying to communicate with a lot of this? Because here we're seeing that type is used both for the presentation of information here, and we're also seeing it used as kind of a graphic element in the design. So, what was the thought process that you were going through with this particular work? Like, what did you want people to feel as they went through it? And what is it about? It'd probably be easier if you explain what it's about, and then people will get the idea.
So wear and tear. So I actually wrote this piece as well as took the photographs and designed these spreads. So basically, this the subject is my good friend Leslie, and she is a ballerina, and so she has been dancing for basically her whole life. And she has struggled with a lot of chronic pain and injury. So it's looking at kind of dance as a theme again. Also as my life being a dancer for most of it. How your body kind of wears down through all of the kind of things that you put it through. And, it's a passion that you love and you keep doing it even though, your body may not be able to keep up anymore. So really these photos kind of touched on the kind of subtle aspects of being a dancer, like the things that, people who don't dance or, aren't super familiar with, would kind of get a hint of what kind of goes into that and what kind of process is there, how do you stretch, how do you, what does your kind of shoe look like, what does your costume look like, what do you kind of have to do to keep your body kind of able to do the things that it does. And there's an interview portion of this also where, I ask her questions and she kind of details about her injuries and kind of what drove her to dance and kind of why she still does it even though she does have a lot of pain. So being able to kind of capture her and her passion and also her pain in these images was something I was striving for, and also kind of giving the reader of this, the ability to kind of understand from her perspective kind of why she does what she does and why she loves it. And so having that kind of dance aspect kind of from the dancer themselves to be to the audience was something I was kind of trying to connect.
So with these, you wrote all of the information with it.
Yep, and then also interviewed her. So those questions are basically call and response. So I would generally ask her questions, and she would kind of delve into things as she kind of felt more open to do so. And then also just kind of talking about the dancer in general in the earlier spreads.
Do you tend to find there's any way you approach it differently between ones where you're able to write the copy, and of course there's going to be a lot of commercial work where you're not the one writing the copy. There's going to be copywriters who will write that. And does that affect the way that you approach the way you design?
Yes, no. I mean, really, if you're designing something that has specific content, I mean, you really need to make sure that the content that is there is reflected in the visual language. So, if there's, let's say, a brochure about mental health, I wouldn't put bunnies on it. Mm-hmm. So it's really kind of catering to, what kind of feeling.
I could think of scenarios where you'd put bunnies on.
Right. So I mean, it all really kind of, like I said, stems back to more of the conceptual idea, where it's like if you have the idea or the meaning to kind of back up a visual decision, that's totally one thing, and that's how creative agencies kind of strategize and how they kind of build marketing campaigns and how they kind of advertise to people. But I think that being able to basically kind of know the copy, internalize the copy, because I think the most important part is that if you have someone else writing the copy specifically too, you should always, always, always read it beforehand, because you want to know what exactly you're talking about. So that way you can kind of add nuances where you feel like you can, and also kind of be able to, the written word is great, but also people love visuals. So it's how do you kind of translate.
Well, the point that you made earlier was that the point of the design is really to communicate the actual message. So if you don't have a firm grasp on the message, it's not clear how exactly you're supposed to do that.
Exactly. So really it's like a very kind of layered process, because you really, it is about communication. That's really the underlying thing. But, you have all of these different elements that you kind of pull in to create your final product or project or message. And you kind of have to figure out how all those things speak to each other, but also how they can speak to someone who isn't familiar, someone who hasn't internalized this information. How is the audience basically going to kind of internalize this and understand things like that?
So here we actually have some of the more recent work that you've been doing.
Yeah, so I have been doing a lot of different kinds of work at my current job at ThinkArgus. One of them being the kind of rise up or show up for her, him, them. Basically, this campaign was for the Providers Council here in Boston. So they do a lot of different things for the human services, basically. And so the idea was, how do we get people interested in human services? Because lately a lot of younger students really don't know what the human services are. They don't know, what's all entailed in that. It's a very broad industry. So the idea for this campaign was really, how do we get younger people interested or asking the right questions to kind of figure out if, hey, this is something that's maybe right for me. You don't always have to have a 4-year degree or even a 2-year degree. You can go to vocational, or you can just go straight from, high school or your GED. There's a lot of different opportunities that were kind of going unmissed. So our goal was to really kind of get people to kind of invest in others while investing in themselves. So the idea for this campaign, I definitely worked with the art direction here, as well as the creative
Now, when you
direction.
say art direction,
Yes.
What is your role in relationship to an art director?
So I am a junior designer, so that was my official title. So basically the way that we've structured ours is that, we have our principal or our founder, and then we also have our creative director. As far as the creative side, there's usually an agency and account side also, and you have your accounts director and things like that.
Your agency, and a lot of agencies are like this.
Right.
You have the principal who actually sits over all the departments.
Right.
And in your department, which really deals with the visuals,
Right.
that's where the art director is really sort of managing the designers who work below them. For instance,
Right.
you're a junior designer.
Right. And so basically the way that, we're pretty small, but we have, a range of people and abilities, which is really great. So basically we have our principal, and then we have our creative director, art director, who kind of oversees and helps manage things. We have a senior designer. We also have a designer and then a junior designer. And we also do sometimes have interns. So basically, we're small enough that we all kind of communicate together and we kind of work on projects together and things like that. But basically, as far as like getting things approved or, just getting feedback in general, you always check in with your creative director or art director, just because they've had usually years and years of experience. So especially as someone who's newer to the field, newer to the industry, being able to kind of work with people who have been here and done that, and really are pushing through new things in the industry has been really exciting. So there's a lot to learn. So anything that I can say, at least for the workplace, it's important that, you really listen to the people who've been there and kind of their experiences, because they're always really willing to kind of help you navigate the early parts of your career, because, they were there too. But yeah, so basically I think that, especially for our agency, we're very small, so we really kind of have that great communication and that feedback process. But yeah, so as far as art direction, sometimes the designer will kind of create it, and then you'll work with the creative director to kind of pull through different things like that. But sometimes, there is an art direction already that's been established by the creative director or art director.
So what is the most significant difference between when you're working alone and when you're actually part of this team? What would you say is like the big, probably leap, because I know when you were doing, of course, the work for yourself, that you had to adjust to this new system. What was probably the biggest difference, do you think?
Kind of going from like freelance and like schoolwork to like professional development?
Yes, to working, on a team.
Right. Thankfully, I was involved in a lot of team-based things, so it wasn't a total culture shock. But, it's very different because anytime that you're in a brand new group of people, you always have to kind of figure out the dynamic and kind of where you fall and kind of what you bring to the table as far as the team-based work. Thankfully, it's like we all really jive well together, and we all are really open to, everyone's ideas. So as far as, kind of jumping from the collegiate aspect to professional life, it wasn't a huge jump for me, just because I had been used to working with people. I had, met people throughout. I was actually contracting first, and then I was hired full time. So I was able to kind of meet with everybody and kind of work with everybody first, and then I was fully hired. But I think that really being able to kind of prepare yourself to work with groups and with others. I mean, especially, people have different leadership styles. People have different ways of communicating. So being able to kind of adapt and understand where people are coming from, and not, being like, oh, if this leadership style totally doesn't vibe with me, it's not that the person and I don't get on, but maybe, we find a way to communicate that works between us both, Right. So it's being able to kind of identify what you feel like you do best and what you bring to the table, and kind of how you best communicate with others, and kind of how you can manage those other relationships also within that.
So this is what we have up on the screen right now.
Yeah.
Now, explain this project. This project is, well, you could probably explain it better than I could.
Yeah, so this is one of the other projects that I worked on while I was still within my first year at ThinkArgus. So basically, we have been doing Partners annual reports for the last few years. So Partners Healthcare, and so this was the one that I had worked on. So the art direction was pretty much set up for the most part. A few spreads, sample spreads were set up, and so basically, once we got the final content, the stories, and we shot all of the imagery, things like that, we were then tasked with how do we kind of make this a cohesive book? How do we make this report interesting and accessible?
So does it start with they send you all of the text that's required and all of their standards as far as like how the design has to be done? So
basically, we kind of help curate content. So a lot of the times, especially for this annual report specifically, there's so many different hospitals within Partners Healthcare. So it's, all these hospitals having these stories from the year that they feel like are really important. So, it's being able to curate those stories and how those stories kind of fit under larger themes, and kind of putting those stories together, and also making sure that all of the hospitals kind of have a voice in the annual report. And, being able to kind of have the imagery also brought in. So the art direction we usually kind of cultivate previously, and we obviously work with the client to kind of make sure that they're comfortable with the direction we're going. And they give approval, basically, and then we obviously have a lot of back and forth as far as approvals and once we get more content. But basically, we kind of try to gauge the content to begin with. So we kind of help facilitate that process specifically for this. And so being able to kind of have an idea of what kind of content is going in, how many stories, what the length of stories are, are there A stories, B stories, and C stories? So does that, have a word count? Is it with a picture, without a picture? There's a lot of different aspects that kind of go into something that this big. I think it was like 52 pages. So
when you say A story, B story, C story,
yeah.
what do you mean by that?
So specifically because there are so many stories, especially within this report, being able to kind of accommodate for content. So you do what we call like pagination. So a pagination is basically kind of blocking out your book and making sure that all of your content is kind of fitting and making sure you have enough pages to be a book. So the print process, you have to have multiples of 4. So basically the idea is that you want to make sure all of your content can fit. So specifically for these, we had 8 stories, which were longer stories that had a specific word count. B stories were kind of medium length stories. C stories were more like spotlights or like call out paragraphs of smaller things that were, more of like highlights versus like full stories. So that's just kind of how we treated the content to try to kind of make it a little bit more bite-sized for the people reading it, but also kind of trying to organize the stories also.
Right, because you don't overwhelm readers by putting front-loading too much information.
Right, and especially, a lot of the theme for this annual report was together. So the idea is kind of like collaboration, working together, supporting each other. So being able to have imagery that also represents that, as well as kind of having kind of an image with a story kind of gives you more context. It gives you kind of the human element. So it's not just, a story with data and, general healthcare concepts. It's really kind of talking about the people too. So that was something that we really strive to do, especially through the imagery and kind of the brighter colors and things like that. So this report was definitely like a huge project, which was really exciting, especially because it was like one of the largest print projects I had worked on at that point, and being able to kind of read all the stories too. So because, it's exciting when you're excited about the content. So that's the biggest thing, it's like if you're designing for something that's, maybe not as, exciting or doesn't make you as passionate, you still can make great work, but, being able to kind of be more invested in the content and more invested in the project always kind of really is a better outcome because you're really kind of out there and going for it. Being able to kind of read all these stories, you really kind of get engulfed and you're like, oh, this is so cool, or oh, this was a really great, procedure that they did. So being able to kind of internalize that and then being able to design for it was something I found to be really helpful.
One thing I've found, and this is another area where I feel like something like the fine arts, sometimes with those, the work kind of emerges, and sometimes it's planned beforehand.
Right.
And I think with design, that's also true, but in a different way. Because I know when I've worked on documents like these long-form documents, things can change through the production.
Oh yeah, 100%.
There's a dynamic process where sometimes it's because of what actually goes on in your team, sometimes it's because of the client and the actual data that changes.
Right, and that's the process. There's a lot of different approvals and kind of back and forth, between any project and client. And a lot of times it can be from either side. It can be like, oh, we got this content and it really doesn't work. We have to pare this down. Otherwise, we have to completely change this visual direction. And sometimes we will have to. But sometimes it's like, yeah, that's fine. Let's, cut down the content and then we'll kind of figure out a way where we can change things up. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting experience trying to, you definitely always try to go in having a plan, but you also can't be too rigid and be too stuck to a plan.
Right.
Because things are always changing, and that's kind of the nice thing about design that I found is that, because you are having kind of a conversation, an open dialogue, a communicative kind of relationship with, content and someone, it kind of allows it to be a little more fluid. So kind of being open to things I've found has been helpful in the design realm also, because you're willing to kind of, even if you have a plan, you can always try to kind of focus in and like hone in and be more organized in the way that you present, content and things like that. But being able to kind of make it more of a conversation is also something important.
I've found that some of the problems that both new clients as well as like new designers tend to have is, and clients will sometimes complain that designers often want to use certain techniques that are kind of trendy and don't really work for their particular industry. But sometimes I've noticed this with a lot of clients where they get stuck on certain ideas. Sometimes ideas that are theirs, sometimes ideas that came out in the process and which at the time feel really strong, but don't necessarily make sense in the final part of the work. And sometimes I feel like that's something that when you're working with a designer, you have to be kind of careful that you don't get too attached to an idea, which might not actually be the right idea for you.
And especially, if you're new to the industry, or if you're just new to freelance in general, or, are in school and working with someone in the community, or working with someone who's kind of an outside person to the design community, it's being able to try to like manage those expectations, but also being able to like not get stuck in your own head either. I think that's especially true for young designers and young artists. You kind of are like, I have this really great idea, and I know that like especially in college that they really encourage you to iterate. So you really want to, you have one idea, all right, copy that idea and try something new. Especially digitally, it makes it so easy now. So you can just make a new artboard, in one of your programs, and then you can just copy it over and you can adjust something without losing anything that you've already done. So, especially for digital, it's like you don't have to worry about paper or anything like that. It's a free process. You aren't paying for extra space or artboards or things like that. So, you might as well do the exploration.
Now, you mentioned the iterative process,
Yeah.
and this is something which in design happens a lot. I know even doing documents like the last one that we discussed, when I've done it, I'm not going to speak for you, but when I've done it, I've gone through like dozens of different like layouts in terms of what the proportions should be before I even get to like the correct proportions and determine how that should be, the system that should be employed there.
Right. Yeah, and it's really, part of it is just trial and error. It's just like what visually makes sense, what feels right, what makes the most sense for this. And, it is a lot of trial and error. And, you have like version 15, version 30, it really just depends. And I mean, obviously the scale of the project, is also important. But, being able to not be afraid to keep saving new documents as you go, or like new artboards, being able to make as much work as possible, because, even if something, you started in like round 2 or 3, let's say, doesn't make it to the end, you can always look back and revisit that work you did, because there's still some gems in kind of what you've done that maybe didn't work necessarily for that project, but might inspire something else later on for something else.
This is something that I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily know about how the design process works, is that the best ideas don't necessarily come from just coming up with the idea and then going forward with that. A lot of the times you have to jump around through the creative process. And I don't want to bore people with the academic research on this, but I'm pretty sure that you would agree with me on this, that you often have to go back to earlier work.
Yeah, you should always be looking back at your work, because, even though you feel like you've moved to a point that you've, gone past what you've already made, it never hurts to always do a comparison, because maybe, we like to call it Frankensteining. You might be like, all right, this new version isn't really working, but I actually had this really nice lockup of this type that I think worked in like version 2. So I'm going to try this version 2 type, and I'm going to bring it into this new one, and maybe it's going to actually work better. So kind of being able to not be afraid to revisit the things you've already done, and not, feel like, oh, those were crappy ideas, oh, I will never use those again. And really kind of being open, and even like different projects, if you have a sketchbook, or even just like old files of just, logo work or concept work, always just keep those things, because it's so important, because you might have like this epiphany, down the road for a project that you wouldn't have even thought of, that you can look back at something you've already done and kind of use that as a jumping off point.
I think this leads into a question which might be important to certain people watching. If you wanted to get involved in graphic design, what would be like some of the places to start? Because this process is actually one of the parts that's most important to actually. People look at the final products and they often think, like, how do I do that exactly? But how you do that is you have to get this process down. So what would you think is really the best place for new people to start? Like,
So
what should they start doing?
So I definitely think that like looking at work is important. I think that being able to be inspired by other designers or other artists, kind of like curating your own kind of taste, essentially. It's like things that you visually feel like represent you or speak to you. Because I think having those as an influence or a reference point is important, because then you can really build to the point of kind of creating your own voice. So yes, the process and the design thinking and the kind of conceptual thinking are really important. That kind of goes through the iterative process, but also being able to kind of find your own voice within that. So I think being able to, if you're just starting out and you maybe aren't taking classes in school, there's a lot of different community programs you can take, like General Assembly, or there's so many tutorials online for programs, that you can get online. So I think that, if you have the passion for it, it's a great way to start it, and go to gallery openings, go to art museums, find work that inspires you and kind of find your own way to do that.
So if people want to see more of your personal voice in design, where are some places they can actually go to look at more of your work? Because I know you have more that's available to see.
Yeah. So my website is shannonreed-design.com. So that's kind of where my portfolio lives. I don't have as much of current work from ThinkArgus on there, but I do have a lot of my personal work, including some of the things you've seen today. So definitely go over there. It has more photography work, as well as design work, and some stuff that I had from my internships at the American Repertory Theater. So.
All right, well, I want to thank you, Shannon, for being on today.
Of course.
And I want to tell all the viewers at home, if you want to see more Shannon's work, go to our website and tune in. We will have more episodes coming up here on Randolph Community Television and online. You can go to findtheminddesign.com, where I will provide all of the episodes soon.